The wind never left the towers of Nantes. Even after the soldiers, the priests, the royal banners, and the breathing heart of the duchy had long since vanished, the wind remained. It whispered through cracks in the ancient stone, carrying the scent of salt and ash, memory and mourning. And if you listened, truly listened, you might hear something else, a voice too small to command armies, too proud to beg, too wounded to cry. A girl's voice. Still there. 12 years old. Standing alone at the highest point of her father's castle. Her fingers, pale and trembling, clutched the frozen edge of the window frame until the stone cut into her skin. Below her, Brittany burned. Farms smouldered. Abbeys cracked under the weight of enemy steel. The flags of France advanced like a plague, one village at a time, each gust of wind pushing them closer. Anne was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be playing in the gardens, feeding swans, learning dances she would one day forget. But her father had died. And when a duke dies without sons, a daughter must become more than a daughter. She must become a duchess, a pawn, a prize, a name in the mouths of men who had never spoken to her. This is not how queens are made. But then again, Anne of Brittany was never meant to be a queen. She was meant to be a sacrifice, and she knew it. The breath she left on the window turned to fog. For a moment, it was the only softness in a world collapsing into stone. Behind her, advisers whispered, argued, cursed in too many tongues. French, Latin, German. All of them debating her future like merchants haggling over livestock. Her body, her womb, her name, her inheritance. All currency now. She didn't cry. Not that night. Anne had already used up all her tears beside her father's deathbed, when the last breath of the last Duke of independent Brittany left his lips, and with it, any illusion that her life would still belong to her. What followed was never her choice. The girl of 13, married by proxy to a man she'd never met, the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian. She recited the vows in a language she barely understood. The hand was placed into another's, a stand-in, a ghost of a husband, as the church declared her a bride and an empire claimed her body as its shield. It was supposed to protect Brittany. That was the lie they told her. If she married an emperor, France would back down. If she became part of something bigger, they'd be too afraid to touch her. But promises made to little girls, especially promises inked on parchment, dissolve quickly in fire. Charles VIII, boy king of France, did not flinch. He did not pause. He did not send diplomats. He sent armies. Columns of steel. Siege engines. Burning wheels. Knights who laughed as they marched. By 15, Anne was no longer a duchess defending her land. She was a girl at the edge of a ruined city, watching the banners of France rise over Rennes. Inside the walls, her people starved. Outside, the cannons thundered. Maximilian sent no army, no salvation. She had married a ghost, and now she would marry her executioner. On December 6, 1491, in the Cathedral of Langes, Anne of Brittany, 15 years old, placed her shaking hands into those of her conqueror. Charles was 21. Not much older than her, but a lifetime more brutal. The ceremony was resplendent. Cloth of gold, trumpets, stones from Africa, pearls torn from the sea, witnesses packed shoulder to shoulder, cheering the unity of two crowns. But Anne's eyes were not there. They were fixed inward on the sound her homeland made when it died inside her. The marriage contract was a masterpiece of cruelty. If Charles died, Anne would be forced to marry his heir. Her body, her future, even her widowhood already claimed by France. That night, in the ornate bedchamber of Langes, Anne was stripped of her crown, her dignity, her childhood. Her wedding was not a union. It was a conquest. The bed was carved with symbols of French triumph, fleurs de lis, lions, naked angels bearing swords. The mattress was soaked in rose water, but the scent was nothing against the reek of fear. Charles entered with the swagger of a young man who had never been denied anything. His jaw jutted forward, an overbite bred from too much incest and arrogance, and his eyes flicked across Anne's body like a man examining his latest acquisition. The door closed behind him. that the chamber was not private. In the shadows stood silent women and church-appointed witnesses. The consummation must be proven. Sheets must be bloodied. Virginity must be verified. And Anne, who had once walked barefoot through Breton fields, who had read Arthurian legends and dreamed of kindness, was about to be turned into parchment. No one wept for her that night. Not even her. The blood was displayed before dawn, and with it, France cheered. They had captured Brittany. They had conquered a womb. They had shackled a girl in a golden cage. But Anne did not shatter. She did not scream. She began to learn. She learned to retreat into silence so complete it could not be touched. She learned to speak in looks, to wield stillness like a weapon. She learned to calculate, to listen, to remember every slight, every insult, every moment her name was spoken without respect. The first pregnancy came quickly. The court was elated the French crown would soon have a child born of victory, proof of divine favour. Anne, meanwhile, walked the halls like a ghost with a crown on her head. She followed every instruction, drank the prescribed wines, prayed at every altar, smiled on command. She dreamed at night of children with grey eyes and ashes for breath. At 6 months, the bleeding began. She knew before the doctors. The child was lost. It had been a boy, perfect, fully formed. He died before ever seeing the world his mother had fought so hard to survive. Anne held him for hours. He did not weigh much, but in him she held the crushed hope of a duchy, a crown, a life that might have meant something else. Charles said nothing. He didn't ask to see the child. He asked when she could conceive again. And so began the cycle: pregnancy, hope, loss, silence, repeat. Each miscarriage was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political failure. Another whisper in court: is she cursed? Is God displeased? Anne's body became a ledger of disappointment. And yet, she ruled. While Charles played war in Italy, while he drained coffers for dreams of Neapolitan conquest, Anne read letters. She signed edicts. She managed ministers. She kept the country from unravelling while bleeding privately in her own bed. The second son lived only 3 days. Her third never drew breath. The tally rose: 6, then 8, then 12. Children lost before the world could learn their names. By the 13th, Anne stopped praying. She began planning. She wrote letters to convents, universities, ambassadors. She arranged degrees for orphan girls. Sponsored Breton poets and sculptors. She filled the empty cradles of her life with legacies no one could burn. She began carving out a space where her power could not be taken, not by Charles, not by the Church, not by France. Then came the accident. 2 damn boys. Charles, ever impulsive, ran down a hallway, struck his head on a door frame, and fell. He died hours later. No sons, no heirs, no apology. Anne was free. For a moment. Then came the new king, Louis XVI, and with him a new demand: marriage. But this time, Anne said no. Not until terms were met. And for the first time in her life, the crown listened. Brittany would retain its privileges. She would not be forced to marry again after Louis. Her children would carry her name as well as his, and most importantly, she would not be conquered again. When she walked down the aisle this time, her back was straight. She was not a gift. She was a negotiator, a queen, a widow, a survivor. And this time, they would not break her. The second wedding was held in Nantes, the same city where she had once watched her world crumble. But this time, the wind carried a different scent, not fire, but defiance. The bells did not toll for surrender. They sang for a woman who had returned not in chains, but in command. Louis XVI was a different sort of man than Charles. Not gentler, perhaps, but slower to strike. More cautious, less drunk on conquest. He had ruled longer, failed more. And he knew something that Charles never had. Anne was not just a womb. She was a symbol. She was Brittany. To control her, he would have to negotiate, and he did. Anne's demands were unprecedented. She secured the autonomy of her duchy, protected its laws, insisted that her coronation as Queen of France not erase her title as Duchess of Brittany. And Lewis, desperate for a legitimate alliance, agreed. They were married in 1499. There were no sheets displayed that night. No crowns waiting outside the bedchamber. Anne made sure of that. She had spent the last decade being devoured in public. This time, she kept what remained of her dignity. The second reign began quietly. While the court preened and plotted, Anne got to work. She restructured the royal household, installed Breton advisers, brought in artists, poets, midwives, and engineers. She reimagined what a queen could be, not a decorative shadow, but a strategist in velvet. She wrote letters in her own hand, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in Breton. She met foreign emissaries, not as the king's wife, but as a ruler in her own right. She did not pretend to be French. She wore Breton lace, commissioned tapestries that told her people's stories, hired scholars to translate their legends into French so that they could not be erased. In a palace that had tried to dissolve her, Anne became impossible to forget. But the one battle she could never fully escape was motherhood. She conceived again. And again. Her body, long since hollowed by loss, endured. Most pregnancies ended the same: silence, blood, shadows at the window. Then, in 1501, something different. The child was born alive. A daughter. She was small, wrinkled, fragile, but she breathed. Anne held her like she had held all the others, and waited for the breath to stop. It didn't. The girl thrived. She giggled. She reached. She grew teeth. Anne cried for the first time in years. But even this joy came with a blade hidden beneath the blanket. Claude was a daughter. France needed a son. And whispers began to stir again. The Queen could not provide. The union might not be divinely sanctioned. Brittany might slip away again if the king had no heir. Anne felt the pressure mount, and with it, the terror of a future she could already see. If Lewis died, if another king rose, and Claude was unprotected, Brittany would be consumed for good. So Anne began to plan. Not for herself. For her child. She arranged tutors, language masters, diplomats, midwives who could teach Claude not just how to survive childbirth, but how to rule. She hired dancers and astrologers and women who had survived royal courts without losing their minds. She taught Claude to read treaties and poetry, to recognize a lie before it was spoken, to remember every name, every betrayal, every silence. Anne had no illusions. She knew her body was failing. By 1512, she had aged far beyond her years. Hale. Tired. Coughing up traces of blood in the mornings. Her spine stooped from too many pregnancies. Her nights broken by memories of too many children buried without names. But she had one final move left. Lewis was aging too. And he had begun to talk quietly, but dangerously, about marrying again if Anne died. Perhaps to a young noblewoman who might bear him sons. Perhaps to someone who would unravel everything Anne had secured. She couldn't allow it. So, she arranged a marriage contract for Claude. A careful, meticulous web of signatures and witnesses. Claude would marry Francis of Angoulême, Lewis, cousin and heir presumptive. It was brilliant. If Anne could not produce the male heir France demanded, she would ensure that her daughter bore the next king. She bypassed the present. She secured the future. And then, as if her body had only been waiting to finish the deal, it gave up. Anne of Brittany died on January 9, 1514. She was 36 years old. A woman who had been married 3 times, endured at least 14 pregnancies, buried nearly all her children, lost her homeland, and yet somehow preserved its soul. The funeral was grand. Dignitaries lined the roads. The streets were paved with silence. Priests chanted in Latin. The coffin was draped in both French and Breton cloth, the symbol of the union she had never truly accepted. that the most important mourning came not from nobles, not from kings. It came from the people of Brittany. Fishermen, farmers, widows, mothers, they lined the paths with rosemary and salt. They didn't speak. They didn't sing. They stood still, proud, as if to say, we remember, we remain. And still the wind whispers through the towers, the same towers where Anne once stood, aged 12, watching her world collapse. She could not have imagined what would come, the nights of blood, the marriages forged in conquest, the sons who never lived long enough to be named. She could not have imagined that the world would remember her. But it has. Not because she ruled with iron, not because she led armies, but because she endured. And endurance, in a world built to break women, is the fiercest form of rebellion. Her daughter, Claude, would marry Francis and become Queen of France. The descendants would rule for centuries, but more importantly, Claude would never be dragged down an aisle by force, would never be forced to marry her conqueror, would never have to display bloodied sheets to prove her worth. Anne had taken the violence of the crown and bent it into something almost human. She had outlived her execution, not by time, by legacy. Grief is not the end of a life. Sometimes it is the second half. And Anne of Brittany, though buried in state, did not vanish with the closing of her tomb. She lingered. Not as a ghost in tapestries, but in policies, in daughters, in memory, and in the strange, solemn rituals of women who had watched her rise, fall, and rise again. It is said that for a full year after her death, the women of Brittany braided their hair in silence, without song. That nurses in Nantes whispered her name into the ears of newborns, even when those infants had no claim to royalty. That somewhere in the mountains, an old woman carved her likeness into the hollow of a tree and called it the mother of loss. History rarely remembers grief. It records battles, coronations, treaties, births, but Anne left behind a different inheritance, quiet resistance. She had lived a life written in someone else's ink, but by the end, she had picked up the pen. Anne's strategy had always been one of erosion. She did not charge at kings. She wore them down. Where Charles conquered by fire, Anne conquered by permanence. She understood the power of staying, of surviving just long enough to outlast the ones who had once claimed dominion over her. She used everything they gave her, the crown, the title, the palace, the money. And she rerouted it all toward Brittany, toward her daughter, toward something that looked like legacy. While France wanted her to be a vessel, she became a vault. A place where memory could be locked and protected, where culture was smuggled under embroidery and in lullabies. Even the royal court couldn't detect how much of Brittany was hiding in plain sight, in music, in naming customs, in the arrangement of flowers on feast days. She buried resistance in ritual, so deeply that it could never be fully removed. But Anne's greatest legacy was her transformation of motherhood itself. In a world that measured women by the number of sons they could offer the throne, Anne turned loss into power. She never gave France the heir it wanted, but she gave it a conscience it didn't ask for. She made suffering visible. She made absence into policy. She reshaped what it meant to mother a nation, not through abundance, but through grief. Most queens are remembered for what they built. Anne is remembered for what she refused to let be destroyed. The patronage of the arts wasn't just courtly performance, it was preservation. Each commission was an act of resistance. She had painters immortalize Breton legends that had once been passed only by mouth so they could not be silenced. She funded schools for girls, not because it was fashionable, but because she knew what it meant to live under the weight of not knowing, not speaking, not choosing. She built hospitals. She made sure mothers who lost children had places to scream where no one would call them cursed. Even in her own palace, she employed women who had lost husbands in battle not because they were useful, but because she understood the cost of love in times of conquest. There is a scene historians often overlook. It's not grand. There are no coronations, no treaties, no dead kings. It takes place in a small room, late in Anne's life. Claude is seated at her mother's feet. She is 14, restless, glowing with the ease of a girl who has never watched a city burn. Anne is sick, but not yet dying. She is weaving something. A belt, perhaps, or a sash. Claude is asking questions about marriage. Anne does not lie. She does not soften the truth. She speaks of contracts and clauses, of men who smile while calculating the worth of your womb, of silence that can become a sanctuary, and touch that can become war. And then, she says something that Claude never forgets. They will tell you that love is a gift, but sometimes love is a lock. And if you must wear chains, child, at least choose the ones you can decorate. It is not a lesson in romance. It is a lesson in survival. Louis Zay lived for 2 years after Anne's death. But something in him had unravelled. Without Anne to balance his court, his reign grew hollow. He remarried, as Anne had predicted he would, but no sons came. His heart failed in 1515, and Claude, the daughter of the girl queen who had once stood in a tower full of fire, became Queen of France. She was 17. She married Francis I, a man who, for all his flaws, had not conquered her mother, had not torn up her homeland, had not branded her value in pounds of gold. And Claude ruled. Not like Anne, but because of Anne. She preserved many of her mother's reforms, kept up the schools, defended the Breton estates, wore the same mourning ribbons her mother had favoured on feast days, even decades after the death. She named her children with Breton middle names, tiny rebellions, carried in cradles. The historians will argue over Anne's true influence. Some say she failed. She lost Brittany's independence. She never gave France a male heir. She was passed from king to king like property. Others will say she succeeded. She preserved Breton culture. She secured a dynastic future. She shaped court politics without ever wearing armour. But they're all wrong. Because Anne's greatest act wasn't political. It was existential. She refused to vanish. In an era where women were erased the moment they failed to serve their function, she stayed. Every time the court tried to use her as a symbol, she rewrote the meaning. She was the queen of nothing, and of everything that mattered. She was the girl in the tower, and the mother of a queen, and the silent architect of memory. And still, the wind moves through the towers of Nantes. It does not mourn. It does not wail. It carries. It carries the sound of a name that once filled treaties and poems and bedchambers and tombs. A name that once meant surrender, then meant survivor, then meant something that no king could define. A girl who was never supposed to win, and who, somehow, outlived the war. There is a myth in Brittany. It is not written in books. It lives in tide pools and mist, whispered by women who do not speak French and do not care for dates or kings or crowns. They say that when Anne died, her heart refused to rest in one place, that it broke into 4 pieces, one for each of the children who had once drawn breath, even for a moment, and that those 4 pieces were buried in the walls of 4 different abbeys across the land she loved, not as relics, as warnings, to remind the living that a queen is not made by the church or the sword, but by what she refuses to forget. It's easy to romanticize her now. Anne, the tragic heroine, the pious queen, the grieving mother, the patroness of poets. But that is not the woman who stood before kings and demanded they rewrite their laws. Anne was not soft. She was not a saint. She was, in truth, difficult, proud, secretive, calculating, capable of holding grudges that lasted decades. She could weep in the morning and orchestrate an alliance by dusk. She punished betrayal swiftly. She expected loyalty in silence. She never forgave the Emperor Maximilian for abandoning her to Charles, even though she was 13, and he was never truly there. She never let Louis forget that their marriage began with a lie. And she never once, not even on her deathbed, pretended to love France. Her heart belonged elsewhere. Literally. After her death, her body was buried with full royal honours in the Basilica of Saint Denis, among the kings of France. But her heart, by her own request, was removed and encased in gold, shaped like a small urn, and returned to Brittany. It rested in the Carmelite convent in Nantes. She had ordered the inscription herself. In this small vessel lies the heart of Anne, twice Queen of France and Duchess of Brittany, who in her mortal life endured much and did all she could. Not who ruled well, not who pleased kings, not who bore sons, but endured much, did all she, though. It is, perhaps, the truest royal epitaph ever written. No triumph, no illusion, just persistence. Centuries later, during the French Revolution, the convent was desecrated. Her heart, or rather, the golden urn that held it was seized, displayed, nearly melted down with other symbols of monarchy. But someone, some unnamed official, some clerk whose name does not appear in the record, hid it, wrapped it in cloth, buried it under floorboards. When it was recovered decades later, it was intact, untouched, as if even fire had refused to consume it, as if Anne had endured again. There is something astonishing about the geometry of her life, the symmetry. Born in a land under siege, died with a nation inside her, married 3 times, buried twice, once in stone, once in memory, 14 pregnancies, 1 surviving daughter, 1 war. No crowns she asked for, and yet a legacy that outlived every king who ever owned her. She was, in many ways, the anti-monarch. She ruled not through decree, but through refusal, not through glory, but through grief. She built nothing grand, no cathedrals, no armies. She built instead something more durable, continuity, the sense that a people, a culture, a memory, could survive, even when carved up, renamed, rewritten, or shamed into silence. She taught us that even the most powerless have power if they persist, that survival, over time, becomes resistance, that remembering not in grandeur, but in ritual, in language, in lullabies is a form of revolution. In a modern world obsessed with speed, with conquest, with volume, Anne offers something rare. Stillness. Depth. The understanding that not all victories are seen, that not all queens wear their crowns on their heads. Some carry them in their lungs, in their children, in the ache between silences. There is a story told, never verified, perhaps not even real, that just before she died, Anne asked to be left alone with Claude. Just the 2 of them. No attendants. Priests. Claude was 15. Eyes full of guilt. Voice shaking. She already knew she would be queen. She wept and asked her mother, was any of it worth it? And Anne replied quietly, firmly, I saved what I could. It is not a line of triumph. It is not a lesson. It is a benediction. I saved what I could. That is what Anne of Brittany leaves us. Not a victory, but a blueprint. A way to live when you are born inside someone else's war. A way to resist when every door is locked. A way to mother, not just children, but a future that cannot yet speak. She did not end the war, but she made sure the fire did not touch everything. And even now, centuries later, if you walk the cliffs of Brittany at dawn, when the fog still clings to the rocks and the salt air stiffens your lungs, you might hear something. Not a voice. Not quite. But a feeling. A pulse in the silence. As if the land remembers her. As if the towers still hold breath. As if the girl who once stood in a window, clutching the cold stone, waiting for armies, is still there. Waiting. Watching. Enduring. Not for rescue. Not for revenge. But for the one thing even death cannot erase, a name. The final act of Anne's story is not written in parchment or stone. It is whispered in the spaces between history and myth, between loss and legacy. It is the quiet resistance of a woman who never had the choice to be a queen, but who became one anyway. Anne's life was carved by forces far beyond her control. Kings, armies, marriages forged in halls she never entered. Yet within that cage of circumstance, she found something unexpected. Agency. Not the loud agency of conquest or decree, but the subtle agency of endurance. The power to shape what little remained. Imagine the child in the tower pale, trembling watching the banners advance. She did not yet know the battles ahead. She did not yet know the price, but she chose to fight in her own way. Not with sword or crown, but with persistence, with memory, with love shaped by loss. The world has changed. But Anne's story remains, not just as history, not just as tragedy, but as a beacon for anyone who has been broken by the tides of power, for anyone forced to carry a weight far too heavy for a child, for anyone who has been passed from hand to hand, treated as a prize or a weapon. The story says, survive, endure, rewrite the rules when you can, protect what matters, even if it is only a fragment. And so, the wind still moves through the towers of Nantes, carrying the salt and the sorrow, carrying the whispers of a girl who became a queen in the only way she could. Not by winning, but by refusing to be erased. Anne of Brittany was a child queen forced to marry her executioner. But she was also the woman who outlived her execution, the woman who saved what she could. If you listen closely, you might still hear her voice,